Hello and welcome to today's webinar, brought to you by the Cyber Hut. My name is Simon Moffatt, founder and analyst at the Cyber Hut. On today's webinar, we're going to be diving into the exciting world of authorization and the evolution of authorization and where it may take us. Before we get into today's content, a couple of little housekeeping things to start with. First of all, we are on Zoom today, so everything is centrally muted, as you would expect, but we do have the chat and Q&A functionality available. So please put your questions and comments into that box as we go through to today's content. We will be leaving a bit of time at the end to answer any specific questions we have, but we'll try and get those questions and comments answered as we go through today. Clearly, we are being recorded as well, so you will receive an email after the event, so you can have access to the video for posterity, so you can watch back in your own time. Authorization and access control, absolutely fantastic topic, which I think now is really key from both from a security perspective and also that business enablement perspective as well. I'm absolutely thrilled today to be joined by two absolutely leading identity experts and veterans in this space. I'm joined by Atul from SGNL and Ian from Weave Identity. So maybe just start off with some introductions. First of all, Atul, thanks for being here and maybe give us a bit of your backstory.
Yeah, thanks for having me. And like it says on the screen, I'm currently the CTO of SGNL, and it's a privilege to be here with my fellow ex-Googlers, and we have the backing of Microsoft and Cisco from an investment point of view. And before this, I was at Google, where I worked a little bit on the CAPE, or continuous access evaluation protocol, as it was called back then, now Profile. And besides that, I have been involved in the development of several identity standards, including SAML. And so I've been in the identity industry for a while, and recently was named as one of the Identity 25 listees by Okta. So.
Fantastic! Congratulations! That's a weighted responsibility to be one of the top 25 in the whole world to solve all of our identity problems. Fantastic! Congratulations! And Ian, welcome.
Thanks for having me. I'm Ian Glazer. Before I started Weave Identity, which is an advisory firm, I was looking after product management for the identity products and services at Salesforce. Prior to that, I was a Gartner analyst. I ran identity and privacy research by way of the Burton Group acquisition. Been in the identity space for a while, which is a euphemism for more than 10 or 15 or 20 years. And along the way, created ID Pro, the professional association for digital identity management, and DIAF, the Digital Identity Advancement Foundation, removing financial barriers from participation in the thing we like so much, which is identity management. Thanks for having me, Simon.
Absolutely fantastic. Well, fabulous. I hate to count the years of experience between you guys here, but it sounds like we're nearly half a century between the two of you, which I think is...
Don't say that out loud, dude. Don't do that.
50-50. Which is great, because the thing for me which I find fascinating in identity is clearly the technology is changing every 3 years, every 4 years, whatever. And that in itself is a fantastic thing to be part of. But I think the business problems are also changing, which is what's making it so relevant to everything we do. You know, when I started off 20 odd years ago, it was very much, okay, do some LDAP stuff. You're the guy in the corner. We don't really care about anything else other than just make that LDAP stuff work. Whereas today, every online transaction has something to do with identity. The whole modern workforce is entirely driven really by how that identity foundation and that identity fabric works, whether it's things like zero trust and others, which we'll sort of dig into today. But I think identity now is such an exciting place, and it's fabulous to see so much change there, which it's great to be a part of. And today's webinar, a little bit of a journey really. We're going to start off with a bit of tackle the foundation of where identity and permissions has been and where it is today a little bit, just to set us on the scene for I guess where we're going to head to with this, and looking at things like zero standing privileges and a few other capabilities in there as well. And I think the really good thing is that identity, not only is it always changing, but the power it has to make change in organizations has never been more prevalent. And I think one of the things that I often look at when we're talking about access control and access management, authorization, is really that it's where the exciting stuff takes place. I think organizations are very much focused on the the authentication part of the identity journey, the tiny little login box, which is the pinch point for all of our interactions. And I think that in itself is a very complex thing. And beyond that, we're starting to see that the real need for change, the real need to look at permission management, runtime access control, externalization of access control as well. And a really simple question is, does security really start once the identity is authenticated? Ian, Atul, any comments on that one?
I mean, the classic, right, is like, think about it this way. Authentication is like chapter 2 in the novel. And there's a whole lot of book that comes after that, right? Like that user journey, whether we're talking about consumer scenarios, we're talking about workforce scenarios, what happens next is the interesting part. And what happens next from a business enablement perspective, from a security enablement perspective, like that's the meat of the story. And the sort of mindset, which I think comes out of physical security, of like, right, we've got a gate, it's authentication, and then that's that, right? Life, life moves on and I don't have to worry about the rest. Like the story's just beginning after that point. And more organizations are starting to say, yeah, well, that's something else, right? What happens next is something else, and it's a different set of infrastructure, a different set of controls, and it's discontinuous. And that discontinuity actually leads to exploitable gaps.
Yeah, and I think, sorry. Yeah, so I was just going to add to that, like, I think there is, as a part of the digital transformation that's happening at enterprises, I think we are now seeing more focus on authorization, because you cannot sort of have the same broad level of access that you had in the past in the future. And there's also sort of a little bit of an interplay between authorization and authentication, because you may want certain things to have really strong authentication, and certain other actions to be just let's say you're just viewing some data that is not very sensitive, you can work with a lower level of authentication. So there's that as well. So there's a little bit of interplay in there as well.
I think that's a really exciting point for me. It's the interplay aspect. I think there's definitely, it's like a perfect storm emerging. I think one is, organizations, they want to do more. And by this, they want to collaborate more. They want to share more with more people. And those people aren't necessarily part of the traditional workforce. They could be supply chain extensions. They could be contractors. They could be third parties. You have the whole consumer thing, which is another beast entirely with this whole PII bandwagon there. But then, as you say, if you're not managing this effectively, the adversarial activity, the bad guys, are instantly going to be in there. And I think, if you're looking at sort of edge controls like MFA or biometrics or FIDO or whatever else, that's great, but that's just one part of this identity lifecycle. And I think if you're looking then at things like session management, you're looking at permission management, you're looking at all of the access control aspects in there, that adversaries will target that if it is isolated and siloed and doesn't have the correct controls there. So I think we're definitely seeing this perfect storm around organizations wanting to do more, and suddenly their existing sort of access control infrastructure is potentially letting them down.
To that point, it's very common, right, in security, classically, to talk about security in depth. We don't talk about identity in depth, right?
Yeah.
We don't tend to do that. And I think that's a disservice, right? Because we're not acknowledging that there's a layer or layers of things that we already do today. Like most organizations already do identity in depth to some degree today, right? They have some admin time controls, provisioning, governance sorts of things. And then they have some classical access management, runtime authentication controls. And so we already do a little bit of this, but we don't talk about it that way. And I think that doesn't serve us architecturally well, right? It doesn't serve us conceptually well because we think about like this happens, and then in another universe, this happens, and in another universe, that happens. And that is overly discrete to our discredit, right? To our actual disservice of not thinking about these things as identity in depth.
Yeah, and
I love
there's
that.
also a little bit of fragmentation there, like because you have your cloud services which are managed somewhat differently, and then you have maybe APIs that are a whole different story in itself. And even though there may be some aspects of identity in depth, it's almost never being thought about as one thing to manage across the enterprise.
I think I love that identity in depth. I think that sums it up really well. I mean, I talk a little bit about the life cycles of identities where, something's got to be created, proved, registered, and then there's maybe if it's the workforce, you've got this sort of join a mover leaver thing, and then maybe there's a bit of changing of access, but typically not always. You seem to snowball permissions, and they become a bigger beast, if you like. And then the consumer space, you may be maybe slightly more incremental, and permissions may come and go and build up over time. But it's a life cycle, and absolutely right, that depth aspect, both the sort of horizontal life cycle of the identity itself, and then the depth of how deep that goes, how you protect it, how you manage it, how far the identity sort of tentacles go into applications, into services and others is definitely a thing. I think just to double click on the sort of fragmentation thing, I think this is a big problem in identity as well, the isolation of all of these different, probably historical identity components. Maybe an old LDAP for directory-based authentication, and maybe you've got an MFA component as well, and then you've got third-party systems, and you may then have a separate federation service that's in there as well. So you suddenly end up with all of these patchwork quilts of identity components. And there's great standards to help interop a little bit in there, but I think certainly if we look at sort of where we were and where we are, that version 1 of the early 2000s where everything was specialist and siloed, and then we sort of moved to the let's deploy a big suite of technology with 15 different installers and all this sort of stuff. And we're sort of somewhere in the middle right now where I think identity is becoming foundational to the business, obviously from a productivity perspective, but also from a security standpoint as well. And I think that is really driving, I guess, this demand for let's look at access control. How can this be improved? And again, whether that's related to things like zero trust and all this sort of zero trust sort of stuff from NIST and other architectural deployments, if you actually look at that in a slightly different lens, it's all access control, it's policy decision, it's continuous access, it's permission management, it's runtime. So are things like zero trust and this ID security landscape, are they helping or hindering the sort of access control story, do you think?
I think it's kind of inevitable, right? Like we cannot avoid zero trust just because we don't like the term, right? Because I think the modern architecture is going to drive everyone to be using zero trust principles. And, identity is a critical part of that, like, because, without checking at every access, whether, who the person is, as well as, what they're capable of doing at this particular time, it's impossible to have zero trust. And so I think what we're seeing is from a more sort of admin time, passive kind of, architecture, you're getting to a more runtime architecture. But that's sort of just one angle of it, right? Because I think the first thing is I feel like you want to have some kind of a policy management at the enterprise level, right? Because you cannot deal with the fragmentation that something like zero trust can bring. Like, how are you managing your SaaS applications, your infrastructure, your APIs, your internal applications, and all these things. Like it cannot have like different management surfaces, right? And then coming down to like, okay, how are you going to enforce the runtime access at the time of access? And then once you've logged in a user, how are you going to manage the session that they're actually in, right? So all of these aspects are now becoming very important.
I think that's true. I think it's been able to break out those individual components as well, whether it's, as you said, session management, whether it's the storage of permissions, whether it's the management of permissions. I think zero trust is the good part of that. Is it's forcing organizations to rethink about their entire infosec architecture, data architecture, but it's forcing them to look at all of these different components individually. And I think maybe 10, 12 years ago, that wasn't always the case. It was like, well, okay, we have this network security stuff, and we can measure the success of that through this public internet, private internet, and it was very much delineated in that respect. But I think we definitely now need to have different measures of success, different measures of what that looks like, how it helps the business, how it helps security. I think it at least helps the discussion, I think.
I think the other thing too is, to me, one of the side effects of zero trust architecture is a need, is both an ability to and a need to gather information, data, and signal from a 10x of endpoints that we had before, right? In the past, like the good old days, it was like zone network. I know where my signals are coming from. I know what my hosts are. I know what they're doing. And that kind of all blows it all up, right? Is, the zero trust model says, well, no, you actually have 10x that. Your surface area is as numerous as your entire device fleet and your employees, et cetera, et cetera. And so now you've got all these other points of information and insight to consider. Now, on one hand, you're drowning in it, right? And identity has been, I would say, late to the table as a discipline in terms of data management and data awareness, where security has, for the last 5-10 years, I think, been figuring this out in different ways. Identity is just getting on that train, so to speak. And I think that's a great thing, right? It offers modern tools to deal with the sort of modern problem set, especially from a volumetric perspective. And I think things like, as we talk about zero standing privilege and some of these other concepts, it's a reaction to that, right? It's a response to saying, well, if I could reason across this larger set of information, how would I do that? How would I do that without, having to 100x the size of my identity team, which is not going to happen. And I think some of this is an interesting and very dynamic response to what we're seeing in terms of modern security architecture now visiting upon our identity infrastructure.
Yes, it's true. I think that attack surface thing is now, the evidence of that is really visible, and by that I mean the problems with having a broader attack surface, more systems, distributed systems, isolated systems. I think the fact that they are now adversarial targets, I think, is now visible, and perhaps maybe 2-3 years ago that wasn't always the case, which I think is actually, I think it's a good thing. I think it's helping organizations really, as you say, manage finite resources. They're not going to get more staff, more software, more everything unless they can put a metric around it and look at success and put that lens on some of those things. And if we're looking at the sort of drivers for change, real huge limitations in how existing authorization components and platforms are delivering currently. And I think, yes, they potentially weren't designed for some of these things that we're talking about, like contextual attacks and dynamic attacks and things like this. But equally, the cost of doing nothing is too great now. And I think we are seeing huge impacts in the ability to deliver, business agility, deliver services, deliver apps, deliver microservices. Clearly, there's an increased risk in security thing there, and it's the cost of doing nothing. It's too high now, is it not?
Yeah, I mean, simple things like, right, even if you're doing nothing in identity, you're not doing nothing in your business, right? You're doing the cloud transformation or the digital transformation. You are starting to use, whatever is your favorite cloud platform, AWS, GCP, Azure, and you're also using things like GitHub, which, are cloud services. And, how are you going to apply the same principles of identity that you had previously to these new types of services, right? And I think that the level of risk that you get into, it's kind of an unseen risk, I think, because until something goes wrong, everything seems okay. And when things go wrong, they go really bad. Like, some of the stuff that happened at a large casino and that everyone remembers very well is devastating to the company, and it was largely, although one can think of that as an authentication attack, it was made as bad as it was because of the access control, right? Because the authorization was not um, tightened down. And so trying to apply an old model of access control to a new architecture is very problematic. And that's the real cost of doing nothing.
Yeah, I think that's a huge point, right? It's not about, I don't want to come across like this, we're victim blaming here. This isn't about doing nothing. This is about applying the things that you can do today, right? The things that your resources allow you to do to a more modern, dynamic, and larger attack surface is the challenge, right? And so you've got a lot of great practitioners out there armed with effectively bronze age weapons, marching against a modern army, right? And this is not to be over militaristic, but like this is kind of a picture of the problem, which is my admin time controls give me only so much control. My runtime controls give me only so much runtime control, but my adversaries are staking out a much larger terrain across which they can actually exploit. And the other side of it is it's not just about the adversary, it's also about the dynamism that we can bring to our enterprise, right? If I only have these a couple of control points, then hey, getting that new supply chain partner able to contribute to whatever program we're working on, and it's going to take 2 months to do that, that's not an acceptable response in business these days. And so we lose out on the dynamic nature of what we could be doing because other capabilities, whether it's information sharing or it's collaboration, have sort of outstripped our ability to control or to govern in a timely fashion.
Mm-hmm. I think that's absolutely spot on. I think there's dynamism on two parts. I think clearly the business doesn't stop still, does it? And that's the other really powerful part. They are continually moving forward, and they probably don't really care about cyber and identity and this stuff, but they have to deliver products, deliver services, and they have to react to competitive pressures and everything else. But clearly, the bad guys, they don't do that either. They continually evolve, and I think we talked about this numerous times in the past, really, around where the adversary is operating from a really asymmetric position. They don't care about compliance and governance and all of that stuff. They think, well, it's a very agile, focused, highly automated attack path with tools that they can get, automated tools from the dark web or whatever. They can be really, really insidious in how they attack certain parts of our identity life cycles. And I think that is really where organizations are starting to think, actually, hang on, how can we be more dynamic? How can we be more modular, responsive, not just spend 3 years designing an RBAC project and suddenly find by the time that goes live, it's already out of date and it's really fragile. So yeah, I think there's definitely, again, both the business and the attackers are constantly moving. And I think, why does all this matter? I think there's, from a landscape perspective or from an architectural perspective, there's some real interesting problems emerging here. I think the sort of 3 V's, which have use often actually various combinations. I think the variety, volume, and the value of the things that need protecting in the organization are just constantly increasing. They're trying to share more, they're trying to protect more. These assets have huge value, be that PII, personal identifiable information. It could be intellectual property from the sort of workforce perspective, but that stuff has huge, huge value to external adversaries. And the variety, the number of systems is increasing, the variety and type of systems and where those systems are located, on-prem, legacy, hybrid systems, containerization, SaaS, that is just proliferating as well, not to mention things like healthcare and IoT and the rest of it. So that problem is bubbling along. And then we've got these three big buckets in the middle, which really intrigue me, because I don't necessarily think they always get the attention they deserve. And I want to start with that static access problem, having this long-standing permissions where an identity gets created and literally on day zero, if you like, before this identity, before this account even authenticates, they suddenly have a whole host of groups, permissions, mainframe IDs, mainframe association, and that stuff never gets moved. They just sit there. And static access, it's been the sort of design pattern for access control forever. But is this not becoming a bit of a latent problem?
Yeah, I mean, sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
So I think there's a couple things about this. Static access or standing access, the idea that your user account is associated with a set of privileges, and 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, that user account is associated with those access privileges, those capabilities, is increasingly a challenge, because whether the individual is actually operating the account, doing what they're supposed to be doing, or an adversary has taken control of that account, those privileges are still there. And yes, obviously, organizations are struggling mightily to continue to do things like quarterly access reviews. They are notionally adhering to the principle of least privilege and saying, are we sure, roughly speaking, that what we've assigned the individual as access rights are the appropriate for their job role, function, et cetera? The reality of it is that the participants in quarterly access reviews more often than not are not application owners. They're not people that know what each of these little access nuggets means. And they don't want to disrupt business. And so you get a variety of rubber stamping. And this is not to slight the people performing these things. It's purely they don't have information to make informed decisions. And so status quo becomes a default. But if we look at this differently and say, like, well, what if only at time of use did you get the privileges you need, even if those are not exactly perfect, right? Let's just take the things that you have today, and when you log in, even, or when we issue you an access token for a mobile app to act on your behalf, we're going to grant you what we think is the closest set of rights you need, and it goes away when that session is over. It goes away when that token is revoked. That dramatically reduces the amount of exploitable capability that is just sitting latent, dormant in a user account. And that can be done with today's technology. Can it be enhanced with others? Yeah, absolutely. But like, you can actually make progress towards these things today. And I think that's really encouraging and powerful.
Mm-hmm. Atul, anything on that one?
Sure. I think, I mean, Ian has summarized it quite well, but, just to add to, like, there's a lot of cost associated with the access review process. Like, I've heard numbers like 10,000 per person that is doing the access reviews, right, per year. And the other thing is the explosion that you get, because the model doesn't fit the requirement quite well. So the explosion that you get in the number of roles or groups that you create, that make it really hard to discern, like, what exactly does this mean from a specific application's point of view or in general, right? So I think in those many ways, like, it becomes really hard for someone to determine whether someone should have access to, should be a member of a certain role or not. And then, then even if you're doing the access reviews well, I think you end up with this sum total problem, right? That the roles represent the sum total of what you're ever going to be able to do in your current position at the company, without regard for, do you really need this right now, right? Because, what if your identity gets compromised? Now the attacker is going to assume all those possible, accesses, and they're not going to have any justification to, do any of those things, but they're still going to be able to do that. And so like Ian said, right, like, being able to determine, like, why do you need access at this particular time to this particular data? That is the most important thing. And then going beyond that, like, okay, you're starting that to access, you have the session, but does the session need to live forever, right? Or can we then stop that session when we think that the access is no longer needed? Right? So these are some of the new things that I feel we can do with the access.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really exciting to me. I think those improvements are huge, because I think we talk about on this slide sort of emerging threats and the reducing the impact of the blast radius reduction there. And I think having an identity which has a huge, vast number of permissions associated, as you say, for the entire lifetime of either the identity or perhaps the job function that they're working upon, and they may well be using 10%, 5%, 20% of those permissions. Reducing that attack surface even by half is a huge win. And I think, we talked about authentication at the beginning and the fact that just do the basics there and do some basic MFA. This to me is the equivalent of this. Look at the basics of what permissions are being assigned, and look to be reducing this attack surface. And emerging threats, that they will target those excess permissions for lateral movement, for data exfil, or whatever it could be. And if those permissions are not being used, it's very, very hard to justify their usage or their association to the identities. And I think this last one I want to double click on as well. This segmentation aspect, I think, is a really powerful concept. I think sort of back in that network space or the zero trust space, that segmentation of the network has become a very common thing. It's breaking things down into small chunks, into VLANs and other things to reduce the impact, reduce movement, reduce exfiltration, etc. If nothing else, it slows down adversarial activity. I think the blast radius reduction here is another really good one, isn't it? It's removing what is not needed and making that attack surface, making it, as you say, contextual just for that event, just for the time the end user is doing a particular piece of workflow or completing a particular task. I think reducing to that level that's got to be a good thing, has it not, from a security perspective, Atul?
Yeah, absolutely. I think today I believe the whole 80% of the attacks involve identity compromise. That's sort of a figure that comes out of a pretty well researched report. And the reason why hackers are going after identities is because there is a virtually limitless blast radius, right? And so if you're able to reduce that blast radius, you're basically making it less lucrative for an attacker to compromise identities, right? So what if I get some users? What if I leave my user's username and password on the street? And if that user can't do anything, then there's no point in me trying to compromise that, right? So an attacker is not going to put in a lot of effort into compromising identities if the blast radius has been severely restricted, right? And we have the technology to do that now. So I think we'd love to make progress in that direction.
Yeah. Let's not forget that this isn't just about adversaries. I mean, sometimes the calls are coming from inside the house, right? People that have access or have accreted access over time in an enterprise may very well be overprivileged in certain contexts, and that either accidentally, in the absence of malice, still have production access or still have the ability to push a change to DNS or what have you that causes outage. And so there's also we don't have to look at this just from an external adversary perspective, but look at hey, who really does have the ability to push changes to core DNS or core network, or who has the ability to whip up new workloads and deploy them in multiple clouds, right? These things may be very legitimate under certain situations, but it's just not right now, right? This isn't the situation, right? You don't have an open ticket to go make a bug fix, or you easily fat-fingered the difference between production and dev, and you pushed a change to the wrong place, but this was not the operating window in which you were supposed to do that. Like that kind of unintended consequence, I think minimizing the blast radius also has dividends to pay there. It's not just about the external adversary.
Yeah, totally.
So it's a really good point. I think the sort of insider threat, I think the insider threat thing in general is often overlooked. But then I think exactly to what you're saying, the insider threat isn't always malicious. It could be non-malicious. It could be simply as you say, a fat-fingered situation, or even things like shadow IT or shadow process, where an end user is doing something which they really shouldn't be doing under the particular context which they are currently under. And I think ultimately the impact is the same, isn't it? The impact is, whether it's a security aspect or a business process failure, they're doing something which they shouldn't be doing. And so if we think about the sort of larger authorization problem set here, I think there's a few ones I want to sort of double click on. We talked a little bit there about that zero standing aspect and moving away from being static, which I think needs context, doesn't it? How can you understand this context, whether it's context, a basic time of day thing, but probably more likely around what the end user is doing right there and then, or requesting to do there and then. So understanding the context, what are they doing? Do they have permissions? Should they have permissions? Is this normal patterns of behavior for them? And is that contextual thing, is that an easy thing to grasp?
Yes and no. I mean, in certain situations, like, let's say you have a REST API surface and, the REST API, the way it behaves is that you get the context in every call. And so that may be easier to glean. But let's say you're just trying to access a cloud infrastructure. There may be nothing inherent in that request to tell you why you're doing that. You have to sort of glean that from other systems of record that you're running your business on, right? So it is possible to establish the context. It just needs a little bit of work. In some cases it's obvious, right?
And I guess that knocks into the other C, isn't it? How can we make that consistent across more systems,
Right.
consistent in the response? How do the two C's connect together?
Yeah. No, that's a great question, because I think if you have, like, inconsistent policies, right? Like, some applications are doing really well in terms of the access controls, and some are not. Ultimately, it's the same data that the hacker or the insider, or the identity is trying to access, right? Like, it might be your customer data, or it might be some critical, like, infrastructure resource that they're trying to access. And if you're not consistent about applying these policies everywhere, then you're going to get into a situation where, oh, I've closed sort of the front door, but I can easily go through the side door and access the same thing that I was trying to access through the front door, right? So I think having a uniform policy management surface that will let you manage everything consistently is very important, and being able to enforce that at the infrastructure level, and in SaaS, and in your internal apps, in your APIs, all the surfaces that you have that let you access the same data, which is really your enterprise's biggest asset. Right? That needs to be done consistently.
The other thing too, Atul, is that consistency isn't just about policy management and enforcement. It also leads to a consistency, at least in theory, to auditability, right? We now have a very standardized way of saying, this is how we are governing this more dynamic world. And we clearly have enumerated the conditions, right? The contextual information required for something to be allowed or something not to be allowed. Now I've got a consistent pattern to then audit that and validate that and verify that, right? And this is something that I'm curious to see what's going to happen in this more dynamic world we live in, which is auditors, a lot of identity-related audit functions come out of the heritage of Sarbanes-Oxley, role-based access control, and segregation of duty. But the world we're moving into is far more dynamic than that sort of world was. How does the audit community respond to that, right? Whether it's internal audit or external audit, they're going to want to see some form of governance controls policy, and they're going to need a way to then validate that what that policy says is being consistently enforced, and they will do that through random sampling. So the mechanisms will now start to change about how that goes about happening, but a more consistent means of understanding what should be in place and then how to validate that, I think is a win, if only because our internal teams can actually go through those exact same processes to validate this is actually working right and do so in a consistent fashion across the enterprise.
That's a great point. You think historically things like IGA, access control, it has been driven by something else, hasn't it? The requirements have been driven by compliance, regulation. I think that's a very different world, as you say, to where we are now, where we have systems all over the place. Some are under control, some are third parties, some are SaaS. They are constantly adapting. We talked about microservices and APIs, etc. It's like going from a waterfall model of deployment where you sort of know all of your requirements up front and you're going to spend 2 years designing, to something where, wow, actually, hang on, we need to know who has access to what across a much broader ecosystem. We need to do it now. We need to imply something much more sort of responsive and focused, which I think is a very different problem space. So yeah, I think that consistency is interesting. And the other C in there is do this continually, over the session, over the constant usage of whatever permissions are granted, making sure that is consistently validated and not perhaps just at the maybe the access request time or when the permissions were assigned. So we're definitely seeing a bigger, bigger problem space to address there. And then, go on, Atul. Sorry.
Sorry, I was just going to comment on the dynamism part, right? Like I think what we've started with is static, where we say we are putting some, admin time controls, and then they are statically followed throughout the lifetime of the accesses or about the user's identity. The dynamism now can go all the way down to the individual sessions that you can stop. So, and there may be some gradations in between where you're doing it at login time or runtime, even in the session time, essentially, right? So just wanted to point that out.
No, that's a great one. That's a great one. I want to double click onto that session stuff in a second, actually. But I guess we're talking about. I guess we've created a lot of problems over the last 40 minutes or so. And let's talk about how we can fix this. We touched a little bit on this sort of ZSP or ZSP concept, but how can we get there? And we're talking essentially about removing all of the permissions which are not really needed until they are needed in that respect. So I guess we're looking at that analysis and that removal process. Is it achievable? How can we start on this journey?
So it's absolutely achievable, and you can actually start today. Right? There are platforms out there, some of your SaaS platforms, some of your own applications, that all you need to have a user account is really just a row in a user table, right? And it doesn't, strictly speaking, need any assigned abilities beyond that. If you can do that coupled with whatever you're using for session establishment to be passed in a hint, essentially, hey, now this person typically does these functions. Here's the role I want you to assign for this session. You're already starting to do ZSP. So from, once I sprung, 10 years at Salesforce practically, you can do that kind of thing in a SaaS platform like Salesforce, right? That's really powerful. Does it need special technology? No. Does it need sort of all of this other infrastructure? It doesn't, strictly speaking, need to. So you can actually start on looking at, this is classic recommendations at first, where is an area whose blast radius you want to constrain, right? Do you actually know? I mean, broadly speaking, one could say production access. Well, that can mean a lot of things in a lot of different kind of organizations, or maybe our supply chain systems. Great. Do you know what they are? And then it's, how far can we get with the existing IGA and IDP tools that we have to say, can we just get to a user row? Can we get to ephemeral users? Maybe, maybe not. So take that census and then start to layer on from there. Oh, I'm going to need contextual insight. Or, oh, you know what? I need something really at call time to make an up-down decision. So you can start today with the tech you have, at least starting with that census of what do you want to protect and what tools do you have available to you today to do so.
I love that. Yeah. I think pragmatic. Yeah, it's good.
No, I think that was a great summary. And what I would like to say is, you can also start thinking about expressing your policies in a more contextual and dynamic way. And when you do that, you will start realizing that, oh, okay, for this purpose, I cannot really currently use the RBAC technology that I'm using. So there may be room for some, newer technology that I can use as a result of that. But you can definitely start today, and like Ian said, identify the most critical parts where you're worried about the blast radius the most, and then that would be a good place to start expressing those contextual policies, and then implementing them, right?
Super, love that pragmatic guidance. The other acronym, because we love acronyms in the identity space, CAPE. CAPE, this is something that's been around for a few years. Obviously, you guys at Signal are absolute experts in this field. So this continuous access eval profile. So this again is bringing in one of the C's, the continuous aspect, and bringing in something much more runtime, much more part of that access path, if you like, that access path to the underlying asset there. And we're looking at, again, the fragmented identity landscape with identity providers, reliant parties, protected systems themselves. And this looks like it's the really powerful glue to, I guess, share some of that risk information across there. What's the detail on this one?
Yeah, I think obviously it's been around for 5 years. I guess that's 2019 early is when sort of the blog came out in Google, and since then it's grown into the standard and in the OpenID Foundation, where I'm still involved in the OpenID Foundation as a co-chair and a board member of that organization. But I think beyond just the standard, I think there are a few aspects here, right? So the first thing is that the need, right? The need for continuously monitoring or continuously ensuring that every access is should be granted or not, right? That fundamental problem exists regardless of the standard, right? What the standard helps with is a sort of a non-prescriptive way of describing some events that happened on your end in order to provide intelligence to other peers to make their own decisions, right? And this is what is unique about CAPE, because it does not prescribe a course of action, although in many situations, what action that other party is going to take. But because the standard doesn't prescribe that course of action, it becomes easier for enterprises to define their own policies for, hey, when I receive this kind of an event from this provider, I'm going to take these actions. So it's completely in the control of the enterprise as to what to do. It's not like you're being told what to do from some other party, right?
I think too that's the huge power, isn't it? It's not being too prescriptive. It's providing that fabric of connectivity, right, that fabric of sharing risk, sharing signals across the infrastructure, but not saying what that looks like, which I think is too fragile, I guess. I think this is a really, really powerful way of not only connecting those disparate systems, but keeping them all on the same page at the same time, which is really what access control is all about. And I guess between the two of those, can we get to something more modern? Can we get to something different? I know there's quite a few questions come through on the chat on the acronyms and terminology. We're going to get to those in a second. But I guess, is this, if we combine these two things together, are we going to get to a future-proof access control infrastructure? Is this going to give us what we need, do you think?
Well, I mean, I would like to get this to the point where identity attacks are no longer lucrative to attackers, and insiders are sort of not motivated to, exploit the access that they have, so that they can compromise the integrity of the organization that they're working for, right? I think it is possible today to achieve these, maybe not everywhere, but start with certain situations and then sort of expand into a greater set of applications and services. But yeah, definitely something that we can start on today.
I think to the point about future proofing, as Joe Strummer said, the future is unwritten, so it makes it kind of hard. But what we know from our security peers is that they've been working in a world of larger data volume, different signal sources, more dynamic response. And obviously, attacks still happen, but the ability to scale the defense is something that I think we're genuinely seeing in our security peers. I think adopting a similar approach will really help the identity space move towards that more the dynamic response of things. I think we didn't get this abbreviation, which is ITDR, the Identity Threat Detection and Response. And I don't think today's infrastructure really allows for response. It's more like ITDA. It's like an alert, right? It's not really orchestrating some sort of response. Things like CAPE are part of that orchestration mechanism, which is a critical building block. The entire shared signals framework really is a way to define that signaling network that'll allow us to do more dynamic response. With the ability to do dynamic response, now we can start to do things that look more like a future-proof solution.
Mm-hmm. No, I think you're right. The future is hard. It is hard to design. I think, but that response bit is key, isn't it? It's being able to understand the problem, have a set of actions, and be able to just do something about it. And I think you're absolutely right. At the minute, it's alert fatigue. We see something, we're not quite sure what that means, and we certainly don't have the capabilities to respond back there. This has been a fascinating journey on a world of the future. We've got quite a few questions coming through on the chat, so I'm going to blast through a few of these before we end. And I guess the first one is it's anonymous attendee actually, but discussion around the Paris Olympics. There's numerous different attacks, and you mentioned one about credential stuffing and residential proxies. But I think the question really is around, and I want to unpick this. They've actually asked, how does zero trust and zero standing privileges, how would it have helped this? And I guess my first question is the difference between zero trust and zero standing privileges. I've got my own thoughts on this, but what's your thoughts there?
Sure, I can go first. To me, I think zero trust is sort of the superset of zero standing privileges, because in zero trust, you want to ensure a lot of things at the time of access, and one of them is sort of the privilege of the user. And so zero standing privilege is like, one aspect of zero trust.
Ian, anything on the zero trust bandwagon?
No, I mean, I think that's a good way to think about it, right? Is the zero trust another way to think about it maybe that there's zero to exploit, right? And that's really what CSP is thrusting at, is saying, like, I'm going to give an adversary nothing, right, that they can use, or I'm going to narrow the window when they can't exploit it, just when that user is in a session. And yes, can an adversary exploit that? Sure, they can attempt to session exfiltrate. But it's narrowed the exposure window. And I think that's important to say, like, look, we're just not going to trust these user accounts laying dormant, just like I'm not going to treat a host that no one's logged into as just a dormant artifact in my network. So I think the similarities are there.
Yeah, I think that is, again, collapsing that attack surface, both at the likelihood and then the impact. I think making both of those smaller is always a huge thing. And that sort of rolls into the next question by a guy called James. He asks, what's the difference between ZSP and JIT, which is just in time? Is it another acronym for the same thing, or are they different? Ian, Atul, anything on this one?
Yeah, maybe I'll dive on this one. So I'm not wanting to split terminological hairs, but this is the way I think about it, which is JIT is a mechanism to get access to someone at the moment they need it. It typically comes at session create time. Now, you also see just-in-time provisioning, same idea, right? I instantiate a session at that moment, I instantiate a user account. Depending on how you do it, the access that's granted after that JIT event remains, right? There isn't the inverse of that, which is like just-in-time removal of these things, typically, again, speaking. I would say ZSP is really, you can think of it as a technique, right? As what we'd like to do is get to this limited exposure window with limited access that's lying dormant. Can JIT be a mechanism to help us do that? Yes, it can, so long as we're also pulling it away at the end of the session, right? And I think that's one of the things that historically JIT tools haven't done as well, let's say.
Great points. Atul, anything on that one?
Yeah, no, I think Ian covered it well. I think of JIT as the mechanism and ZSP as the result. And like Ian said, there are limitations to tools that offer JIT today, but ZSP is the goal.
Super duper. One last one. We've got time, I think, for one more question. What is the Cape Hub? Cape Hub is where we get our capes for the heroes. What's the Cape Hub, Atul?
Sure. So, like I said, CAPE by itself or SSF is non-prescriptive, right? It doesn't tell you what to do with the events you receive. The second thing is that as an organization, you may be connected with a lot of different sources of events, and you may have a lot of different places that you want to send events to, and some of the systems that you're integrating with may not be capable, sorry for the pun, which means that they don't speak the CAPE protocol or don't speak SSF just yet. And so, you want to have something that can let you define your policies across the enterprise. It lets you recognize the incoming events, process those policies in the context of those events, take certain sequences of actions, express them in either CAPE, SSF, or something else like a proprietary integration. So all of that together is sort of the Cape Hub feature of Signal.
Fantastic. That sounds like a really exciting project. And I think, again, back to the sort of identity in depth, identity lifecycle. Identity is such a broad school, isn't it? I think getting as many different parts and components integrated, talking together, and doing it at the right time, I think is hugely important. I noticed there's quite a few different vendors involved in that Cape Hub, which I think is a really super initiative. We're coming to the end of the hour here. I think that one or two questions we'll probably maybe try and answer offline as well. But Ian, Atul, absolutely, thank you so much for sharing your worldly expertise, that half century of knowledge and experience. We've tried to condense into 58 minutes. So any last minute quick comments before we end?
For me, go ahead, Atul.
Okay. So thanks so much for having us. I think it was a great, great discussion. I think maybe I can look at the questions after the call and answer them offline. But yeah, I think this is an amazing journey that we are on. I would like to make sure that we focus on the secured outcomes and not sort of the specific technologies that we all would like to use. Right?
Love that. Ian,
just for me, I think this is a super exciting time in the identity market, both from a market dynamic and technology perspective. Like this is fun, right? Like we're starting to see something new that's actually really powerful that isn't just, marketing blitz. And that's cool, right? We can affect new kinds of outcomes. And to me, that's super exciting. So Simon, thanks for facilitating the conversation and love talking about it.
Access control is fun. Let's end on that one. I think it's a hugely exciting area, and I think the benefits are just absolutely tremendous from a security perspective and from a business enablement perspective. So again, thank you, Ian. Thank you, Atul, for sharing your words of wisdom. Thanks to everyone who attended, and until next time, thank you very much.